What's going on, everybody? Bit of a different video for me here. In fact, this is actually the first Magic the Gathering video I have recorded. So a lot of people have been discussing for the past couple weeks or so the ban that is coming up in just a few days, really, like the end of this month. And I wanted to, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot for, God, it feels like a couple of months or something like that. That the standard meta right now just doesn't feel very good and doesn't feel very fun to play. So I wanted to make my own video, and this is definitely going to be different from the other ban videos that people have made. I've kind of got some thoughts and opinions that are a little bit edgy and against the grain, and that might even irritate some people, but I'm just gonna kind of take the plunge here and just put my thoughts out there. So first off is the one that everybody's talking about. This card needs to get out of here. I mean, it's just, I don't think this is up for discussion. You got every single top 8 performing deck in the recent Pro Tour from this past weekend running multiple copies of this card. What was it, like 28 possible copies out of, or 28 copies out of 32, something like that, something ridiculous like that. It's just absolutely insane. I actually think that the recent Pro Tour this weekend was very important because it definitely unveiled and just put right on display, hey, we have a problem here with just the same 3 decks being played over and over and over again, and the same 2 decks in the entire top 8, right? So I don't think this is really up for discussion. Monstrous Rage needs to go. This card is just absolutely broken right now, and it will not rotate out when the new set is released. So I think this is kind of the one that everybody can agree on. Next one is definitely another one that a lot of people are talking about, which is the Cutter. Is it prowess just running rampant? Easily the most played deck in the Pro Tour, and probably the most played deck on ladder as well. It's kind of close between that and mono red, but we all know that this card is absolutely insane. I'm going to reiterate what some other people have said, which is that this card is still new. It just came out in the Dragonstorm set, and it feels a little impulsive to ban it this early. And I'm actually inclined to agree with that. I don't think that this card in particular is so as ridiculously overpowered as people are making it out to be. It's just that it fits into a deck that has too many pieces that work too well. So I'm not going to say that this definitely needs to be banned, even though this is probably the card that people are feeling the second strongest about behind Monstrous Rage. But I think it would still be healthy for the metagame and just for people's enjoyment and casual players trying to get into the game, or people just trying to experiment with different decks. It would be healthy for all of those things and just Magic as a whole for this card to get banned in standard as of now. But I do have some other opinions that are going to come a little bit later that I think might be able to keep this card in. Next up is probably also not so surprising. So I'm basically hitting the 3 decks that were played the most at the Pro Tour this weekend, and it's this friggin' thing. So there's a lot of people that have thoughts about Omniscience. My personal feeling on Omniscience is a little bit different from other people. So I feel like if the structure of the standard format was like it was back in the day, when you just had block sets and there were just 6 sets and a core set in every single standard rotation, and that's it, I think this card would fit totally fine. But the fact that we have such a wide pool of cards, and it's going to stay like that for the next couple of years, the card pool is just going to be huge. The card pool is massive right now. That is why the decks are so overpowered, and the standard game ends on turn 4 consistently with multiple decks winning on turn 4, right? That's why it's like this, because you have such a wide pool of cards, and when you have such a wide pool of cards, that doesn't do what you might think. You might think, oh, it opens up the door for more decks to get in and more decks to get played. That's not really true. when you open up the card pool, the strong decks get stronger, the weak decks get weaker. It's a more divisive thing, generally speaking. So by widening the card pool so much, it has made the decks that were viable and that were good just even better, and other decks have gotten left behind, and people have just been magnetized to the strongest decks. So that's why I'm saying Omniscience should not exist in Standard right now, especially not in Foundations, because Foundations is going to last for 4 years, or is it 5 years? I forget. It's like 4 years or something like that. So that means that at any time in the next 4 years, this card can become unbeatable. That is insane. That is so insane. You're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of cards getting printed in the next 4 years, and it's very likely that there will be some combination of cards that utilize this thing in an abusive fashion. This thing needs to get out. It needs to get out of the current Standard meta for the foreseeable future, or else we're just never going to enjoy playing against this deck. Losing on turn 4 to this card is just straight up not fun, and there's nothing you can do. I mean, there's a chance that you can still kill it and your opponent might not be able to find the resources to keep going for infinity until they win. But even so, it just doesn't make the game fun. It's just not fun to play against, period. And here's the thing, you know, a lot of people have talked about banning Abuelo's Awakening instead, and yes, that would seemingly slow down this deck enough that it would not be so overpowering. But instead of Abuelo's Awakening, these decks can just play Repair and Recharge, which is obviously 5 mana instead of 4. But look, those decks don't even always cast Abuelo on turn 4, and then they still win. So just this card by itself, even though it's 5 mana, this could still make this deck extremely powerful. Now, maybe it brings it down to a level that is not so overbearing. But the thing is that, again, it's the fact that the pool of cards in Standard is so wide that Wizards would have to make sure to never ever print a card like Abuelo's Awakening for as long as Omniscience is still in Standard, which is going to be the next 4 years. Don't you see what I'm saying? It's a huge undertaking. You would never ever be able to print a card like this. And if they did, it would be a mistake. So they cannot print a 4 mana card that allows you to bring Omniscience back onto the battlefield. They have to make sure that they always avoid doing that. And with the thousands and thousands of cards that they're going to release the next 4 years, the chances are they're going to slip up or they're going to forget about it or whatever. I don't know. Like, it's this card, this Omniscience card is just too taxing. It's too taxing for the player base. It's too taxing for the meta. It's too taxing for Wizards to make sure that it's not overpowered. They have way more flexibility with what cards they can make, what they can print, and what they can do if they just ban this card in Standard. It shouldn't be in Standard. It belongs in Modern. It belongs in the more expansive formats where the power level decks should be ridiculously high, you know, exponentially stronger than Standard. So that takes care of the 3 cards that people seem to be talking about the most in the top 3 decks. And now I'm going to kind of expand out to my kind of rebel way of thinking here and just talk about a few more cards. Next one on the list is one that should have been banned a while ago. It is obviously the Beans. I don't know why this card was not banned when Domain Overlords was going crazy. And honestly, even though green is the weakest color in Standard right now, this card is still ridiculously strong. Now, I actually do play a fair amount of green. I have a Dragonback Assault deck that I really like. I have a Sultai Dragons deck that I also like. I even have a big Gruul deck that I like to play, and this card is pretty much in all those decks. But even so, let me tell you, especially if you're playing Sultai, casting Rakshasa's Bargain on turn 3 with this thing on the field is nuts. It is absolutely nuts. You get to draw 3 cards, and you draw one, and then you get to look at the next 4 and draw 2 more. That is absolutely bonkers. That is bonkers that I'm able to do that with my Sultai deck. And then obviously, subsequently, if I'm just throwing down dragons and everything in that Sultai deck, I'm just going to keep drawing cards off of Beanstalk. It is way, way too much value. Furthermore, there is a new deck in the meta, courtesy of Final Fantasy, that is gaining a lot of traction. and I have been playing against it a lot recently in the past few days, and that is the Yuna enchantments deck. Let me tell you, I don't know why more people are not talking about it. This is going to be the next deck that just completely takes over. Even with graveyard hate, it is not enough. This deck is too strong, and the Beanstalk just makes it even more so because you got tons of overlords. Yuna herself is 5 mana, so you draw a card off that. And even with graveyard hate, trust me, I have exiled an opponent's entire graveyards against that deck, and it still finds a way to claw back because there's just so much card advantage. Like, you exile their whole graveyard, okay, guess what? They have a whole new hand full of 7 new cards. They have an overlord of the Baelmerk. They're going to mill 4 new cards, and then they got infinite ways to keep doing that and then just reanimate it and keep repeating the cycle over and over again. This deck is really, really, really strong, and with the Beanstalk in there, it's just even more so. And even when they lose the Leyline binding, it's not going to be enough. This deck is not going to slow down, but taking out the Beanstalk is going to bring this deck to a normal power level, because just trust me, mark my words, you're going to be seeing this deck a lot more. It's just going to ruthlessly stomp all over us. The next card I'm going to show is another one that is featured in a lot of decks, but I think is just way too much value, and it might be the alternative to banning Cori-Steel Cutter. That card is Stock Up. So I feel like it's not necessarily the Cori-Steel Cutter that gives the Is It Prowess deck so much value. It's their ability to completely reset and just never stop the value coming in over and over and over again. And that's what Stock Up does. You get to look at, this is one of the best draw spells that has ever been printed, in my opinion. And it's just 5 cards, 2 of them into your hand. They don't even go into the graveyard, the other ones. There's no downside to this card whatsoever. And casting this on turn 4, getting your land and your 1 mana spell, and then just prompting Cori-Steel Cutter again and playing whatever 1 mana spell you have. It's just, this is how those decks are running us over. It is definitely more so because of the Stock Up. So I actually think that if you remove Stock Up and Monstrous Rage, the Is It Prowess decks kind of lose a lot of their power, and it might not be necessary to ban the Cori-Steel Cutter, even though they still have VV, and VV is very strong. It's just with the Stock Up, especially with a VV in play and the Stock Up, that's just nuts. And obviously it's not just the Is It Prowess decks that use Stock Up. I have some control decks that I use Stock Up in as well, and even just not necessarily control decks, but mid-range decks use Stock Up because it's so valuable. But that being said, I do think that there is a very good replacement for Stock Up in all of these decks that is still extremely good value, but will bring down the power level to a more balanced state. And that card is Winternight Stories. I find it kind of surprising that Winternight Stories is a rare and Stock Up is an uncommon, but Stock Up is literally just so much better. I mean, I guess Winternight Stories does have the Harmonize, right? But I mean, come on, like, Stock Up is literally just better, and it's the uncommon, and Winternight Stories is the rare. Like, Winternight Stories could easily just be an uncommon, and it would just be a good uncommon. So Winternight Stories is just 3 mana. Obviously, you're drawing 3 cards, discarding 2, unless you discard a creature, and it just fits in a lot of decks. I mean, it's better to play a deck that does have some creatures. You probably won't want to just play this in a straight-up control deck, because then you're going to discard 2 cards. But if you have a deck that has some creatures in it and you don't want to keep playing the same creature, then you can just get rid of that and then you keep 2 of the cards. So this is, I think, a good balanced replacement for Stock Up. So now I'm going to start really getting into some things that I feel like people are not going to agree with me on, but I'm just going to share my thoughts anyway. So the next card is yet another red card, and it is just, I gotta say, I have felt like this card didn't belong in standard for a while because of its length, because of its text, and that card is Screaming Nemesis. So again, people may not agree with me on this, but in my opinion, this card just has way too much going on for only 3 mana. Just imagine for a second that this text right here, the about not being able to gain life, imagine for a second that this was not on the card. If this was not on the text, this card would still be very, very strong as a 3/3 haster for 3 that deals that much damage to any other target if it's dealt damage. So you can still just effectively lava axe your opponent or something even without the additional text. But the fact that the life gain disruption is not even temporary, it's permanent for the whole game, to me that is just absurd, because you're talking about a aggressive deck using this card because it's a 3/3 haster for only 3 mana. So you're probably going to be taking a lot of damage in whatever deck, against whatever deck this card is playing. And one of the ways that you can kind of come back from that is gaining life. And not only that, even without needing to do that to kind of survive and stabilize, there are several decks that use the life gain as part of the archetype. This card literally just stops all of that. It stops entire archetypes from being able to do whatever they want. You're talking one card that can prevent an entire deck based on gaining life from doing its thing. You just have to forfeit at that point. That, to me, it's absurd. It is absolutely absurd that you are not allowed to gain life for the entire rest of the game. And it's compounded. It's compounded by the fact that this is a red aggressive card in decks that are going to want to be aggro and play aggressively, and now you fall behind and you can't catch back up. It would be one thing if either this was more mana, like 5 mana or something, or if it was a blue creature or something, or maybe even possibly a green creature, because green is not typically that super fast, right? Because then you might not fall so far behind by the time that effect comes into play that you can still survive a little bit. And if this had said something else, like what if it said, you know, damage can no longer be prevented for the rest of the game, or you gain hexproof for the entire rest of the game, or something like that. You know, the fact that not something that compounds with the types of deck that this card is put in, you know, the fact that it compounds with the type of decks that it's playing in my opinion, it's just absolutely ridiculous. You can just do tons of damage to itself, hit your opponent for a whole bunch, and now they can't get that life back. It's absurd to me. And I really, really don't like how it completely nullifies a big aspect of the game that a lot of decks use. It's just too much for only 3 mana. And to that end, I feel like it's similar to Stock Up, because I feel like Stock Up is too much for only 3 mana. You know, if this was like 4 mana, then I think it wouldn't be so overpowered. But the fact that it's 3 mana, it's just too much value. So there's a more complex layer to this whole thing that I'm saying. And a couple people have mentioned it, which is I'm kind of glad to see. The power level in standard right now is just extremely high, period. And if you end up nerfing down some of these decks, like especially if you nerf down mono red and Is It Prowess and even Omniscience, then what deck is going to take over next, right? It leaves room for the next deck in line to become the most overpowered deck, because now these decks that were previously really, really strong can't keep up with that deck. It's just a big mess. I really, really wish they did not do this big extended lifespan to sets in standard. I think it was just a big mistake. So, you know, now it's like you have to ban up the Beanstalk, because otherwise the Beanstalk decks become too strong, right? So to that end, there is a deck that I feel like can make a roaring comeback with a vengeance. Not the same vengeance that the Screaming Nemesis is feeling. There's a deck that I feel like can really come back in a big way, and that is the Pixie decks. So, I mean, look, even with the power level as it currently is, only 1 mana to do this, and then just replay your enchantment that messes up your hand or sacrifices your creature or whatever. This deck is still really, really strong. But that being said, I don't think banning Pixie is the right move, because it does have some room in potentially some other decks, because it's kind of a fun and interesting card, you know, that you can return a permanent and then play it again, right? I mean, it could potentially see play in some other decks that are a little bit more experimental and you know, they're not super overpowered, or they're not super powered or anything. So I don't think banning Pixie is really good idea because I think this card could potentially be good for standard. It could make some interesting concoctions, right, that people can come up with. But instead, there's a deck that is kind of a linchpin for the Pixie decks that I think should go instead. And that card is Hopeless Nightmare, which is probably where some of you thought I was going with this. This thing comes down. Pixie comes down on turn 2. This thing comes down again. And then before you've been able to do anything, you have lost 2 cards and 4 life. Just think about that for a moment. By turn 2, you have not only lost 4 life, you have lost 2 cards in your hand. That to me is just nuts. Like, what if you had to mulligan down to 6 because you got a handful of 6 lands or something, or 1 land? So now you're just down to 4 cards, possibly less. You've lost 4 life already. How are you supposed to come back from that? It's just such a momentum breaker. Haha, see what I did there? Such a momentum breaker before the game has even started rolling. And not only that, black is a pretty strong color right now. And I feel like we also do need to be careful with the black decks because I also think that could be a deck that kind of gets out of control real fast if these other decks are brought down. I think that all that needs to be done is to just ban Hopeless Nightmare, and the Pixie decks then are still really strong. You know, they have Sun Pearl Kirin, and then the Fear of Isolation, right? The 2 mana spells that also bounce other permanents. So those are, you know, very viable options for the Pixie decks, but it just doesn't feel so debilitating if you remove the Hopeless Nightmare and then they still have access to all their other options, right? So now I'm going to talk about a card that I personally don't think belongs in standard, but I don't think people are going to agree with this. But I'm just going to share my 2 cents anyway, although I guess at this point it's like not 2 cents, it's like $2,000 that I've been sharing, right? Because I keep talking so much. But so that card is Zombify. I feel like I'm already going to get a little flamed for this, but I just feel like being able to cast these super overpowered creatures like Volgavoth or Atraxa or a Tali or even a Carnosaur on turn 4 is just too much. Like, that's just too much in my opinion. And again, it's because this card by itself is not a bad card at all. You know, 4 mana, you get to reanimate something, right? But the fact that the card pool, again, the main problem with standard right now is the card pool. It's too big. And you got all of these overpowered creatures. Now, there are plenty of ways to reanimate in Rakdos, but they're just 5 mana. So you got Rakdos Joins Up, Coiling Rebirth, Evil Reawakened, Defossilize. I'm surprised that I don't have a copy of Coiling Rebirth. That's interesting. But you know, there's all these 5 mana spells to reanimate, and that's honestly the way that I feel like it should be. It should be 5 mana to reanimate something. That feels like it keeps the reanimation decks in check and at a power level that makes sense. Like, look, you had Cruelty of Gix for a long time. That was a 5 mana reanimation spell, and that Rakdos reanimation deck with Carnosaur and Geological Appraiser stuff was really, really strong. Now, granted, the Discover 5 and Discover 3 had something to do with that, but still, even without those cards, you could reanimate stuff for 5 mana, and it was a really viable option. But being able to reanimate anything on turn 4, and it could be this really overpowered creature. Actually, I just realized, you know, in the creatures that I listed before, both Atali and Atraxa are rotating out, right? So I guess those aren't necessarily a problem anymore. But still, you know, if there's any overpowered creature at all in the huge wealth of cards in standard right now, like, you could reanimate the new Saga creature Bahamut on turn 4. What are you going to do against that if you reanimate Bahamut on turn 4? Like, you're just, what are you going to do? And even though you can remove it, you can, you know, sacrifice it, you can possibly kill it and all that stuff like that. But then guess what? This is a Rakdos reanimate deck. That happens turn 4. You spend your turn trying to get rid of it. And then turn 5, it comes right back unless you have exiled it, right? I just don't think you should be able to reanimate any creature that you could want on turn 4 when there are this many cards available in standard. So that kind of wraps up my Again, my very against the grain opinions on standard and on the ban list. I just think that the power level in standard is way too strong right now. There shouldn't be cards in standard that can pretty consistently win on turn 4. There shouldn't be cards in standard that pretty consistently set you at a massive disadvantage by like turn 2 or 3, even if they're not aggro decks. Like, it's just, so I just think it's bad for Magic as a whole if decks are too powerful, because new players come in, they don't know what they're doing, they get completely run over, and then they just go to the internet and they just look up the most powerful decks, and then they just play the most powerful decks, and that's it. And look, that's going to happen regardless, but what I'm saying is that it just doesn't allow breathing room. It doesn't allow room for experimentation. I like to experiment. I like to try different decks. I think it's fun. So I don't want to just keep playing the same things over and over again. And I don't want to keep playing against the same thing over and over again, right? I just don't think it's healthy for the game. And look, Magic is like the best card game ever. You know, it's a shame that it becomes stale and bogged down and even diluted to a sense, you know, where it's just the same boring stuff over and over and over again. And it's so highly competitive that people are being pushed to the point where you have to have this maximized, overpowered deck that must win by like turn 4, must win by turn 5, or it has to have an answer to everything. So that's pretty much the only way that I've been able to experiment with decks, actually, is running blue, so that way I can just run counter spells and bounce spells, and then whether it's red or black or green or whatever to go along with it, to kind of apply some pressure, right? That's the only way that my experimental decks have been surviving, is to just try to have an answer to everything, turn after turn after turn after turn, right? Which is a little exhausting after a while, you know? So anyway, I just think that it would be better for Magic as a whole, with this crazy amount of cards that is available in standard, that makes it not feel that different from Pioneer, not that much different from Modern, right? Because the card pool is just too freaking big, that the power level of everything just needs to be brought down. And again, more importantly, I'm going to kind of go back to my previous point that I made, which is if you nerf one deck, then you have to nerf the next deck, then you have to nerf the next deck, and then you have to nerf the next deck, right? And then even the next deck, because as soon as you nerf the most powerful deck, the next most powerful deck completely takes over, runs away with everything. Then the next most powerful deck runs away and takes. See, it shouldn't be that way. There shouldn't be this big divide between the top tier decks and then the decks that people want to brew and experiment with and all that stuff, right? So anyway, I talked a lot more than I was kind of expecting to, and look, I know people have a lot of strong feelings about this, so I'm not asking people to agree with me. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm not trying to say that I'm right or any of that nonsense. I'm just putting forward a few points because I'm very glad that people are discussing this, that people are discussing that standard is not in a good state. And I feel like the more people that talk about it, Wizards is more likely to do something about it. Now look, it's easy to be pessimistic about it and just think that, yeah, they're just going to say standard's fine, or yeah, there's too many decks that are strong, so it doesn't matter, or yeah, everything's rotating out in a month anyway, so we'll just see what happens, blah, 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 blah. But I'm just hoping that by everybody talking about it, including me, that somebody's going to pay attention. So anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.